Welcome back to Curious Minds, a space where we explore mysteries, history, science, and the ideas that shape how we see the world. And every episode is a deep dive, grounded in research, storytelling, and curiosity. I'm your host.
And I'm here to help peel back the layers on today's topic.
Today, we are tackling a massive topic. We're going to be dissecting the specific decisions and the leadership failures that really lost World War II for the Axis powers.
It is a huge one, and we're not just going to, recite a list of battles and dates. We're really trying to get into the psychology of the collapse.
Right. The central argument we're unpacking is that World War II wasn't lost in a single battle. It wasn't just Stalingrad. It wasn't just D-Day.
Right.
It was lost through this cumulative chain of arrogance, impatience, and just catastrophic leadership decisions.
Exactly. It's the human factor in the high command. And today, we're going to break down how Hitler and the Axis powers took this position of, early dominance and turned it into total collapse.
And it really was total collapse, the complete disintegration of a state. But before we get to the bunker in Berlin, let's set the stage a bit. We all know the basics, Axis versus Allies.
Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan against, pretty much the rest of the world eventually, Britain, the Soviet Union, the U.S.
But I want to start with the scale, because when you look at the numbers from, say, 1939, it's not immediately obvious that the Axis were doomed to lose.
No, not at all. Actually, quite the opposite. In 1939, Germany had arguably the most professional, best-equipped, best-trained army on the planet.
And a tactical doctrine that was just light years ahead of everyone else.
It's decades ahead. But you're right, the seeds of their defeat were already there, hidden in the economic data.
That's what I was looking at, the GDP comparisons. The Allied coalition, even early on, had this massive potential economic advantage. But Germany wasn't planning for that kind of war.
That is the absolute key. Germany was betting on a series of short, sharp conflicts. A knockout blow here, a knockout blow there. They absolutely knew they could not win a long war of attrition against the British Empire and, potentially the United States.
So the whole strategy was built on speed.
Everything was about speed.
Which brings us right to that early German advantage, blitzkrieg. Now, most people know the translation, lightning war. But let's get into the mechanics of why it worked so well, especially in France in 1940. Because it wasn't just that they had better tanks.
No. In fact, you could argue some of the French tanks were better. At least on paper.
Better armored, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. The French Charbie 1 was a beast. It could take a direct hit from almost any German anti-tank gun at the time and just keep rolling. But Blitzkrieg wasn't really about the quality of the metal. It was about the radio.
This detail is so fascinating to me. The German panzers had radios in every single tank.
Every tank. Meanwhile, the French commanders were still using flags, messengers on motorcycles, pigeons in some cases. It was archaic.
You had the French commander-in-chief, General Gamelin, sitting in his headquarters just outside Paris, and he didn't have a single radio telegraph.
It's unbelievable. He was issuing orders that took hours, sometimes a full day, to reach the front lines.
While the German panzer commanders, guys like Guderian and Rommel, are on the radio talking to each other, talking to their air support, coordinating in real time.
They were operating inside the French decision loop. Before the French even knew where the attack was, the Germans were already miles past them, creating chaos in their rear.
And then there's the audacity of the plan itself, the Manstein Plan. Everyone, and I mean everyone, expected them to just repeat World War I and go through northern Belgium.
The Allies had their best armies waiting there. It was the obvious move.
And instead, they punched through the Ardennes forest.
The impenetrable forest.
Right. Impenetrable.
And, ironically, in doing so, they created this massive vulnerability for themselves that the Allies just completely missed.
What do you mean?
Well, that German armored column moving through the Ardennes was over 100 kilometers long. It was bumper-to-bumper tanks and trucks, all stuck on a few tiny, winding forest roads.
It was the biggest traffic jam in military history.
Exactly. If the French Air Force had just sent one reconnaissance plane over that forest and seen that column,
they could have destroyed it. The war might have ended right there.
It might have. They were sitting ducks. But the French command was so paralyzed, so utterly convinced that tanks can't go through forests, that they didn't even bother to look.
That paralysis is the key. France collapses in just 6 weeks. The world is just stunned. And this right here is the first major psychological turning point for Hitler.
Yeah.
He feels invincible. He starts to truly believe that he is a military genius who sees things that his professional, Prussian-trained generals just don't.
And that hubris, that arrogance, leads directly to the first major unforced error of the war, Dunkirk.
Okay, let's drill down on this. The halt order. The popular story is often that Hitler let the British go as some kind of peace offering, or that he was just incompetent. But the reality, when you read the diaries from the German High Command, it's more complicated.
It is more complicated. And it wasn't just Hitler's decision alone, which is a key point.
Right.
General von Rundstedt, who was the commander of Army Group A, he was actually the one who first suggested pausing the advance.
The guy on the ground.
The guy on the ground. He's looking at his panzer divisions, and they had been running nonstop for 2 weeks. Half of them were broken down or desperately needed maintenance. The terrain around Dunkirk is all marshy and full of canals, not good tank country. He was nervous.
So the professional general gets a case of the jitters, and Hitler, he validates that fear.
Exactly. Hitler flies to Rundstedt's headquarters.
Yeah.
He sees his best general is anxious, and because Hitler himself is actually quite risk-averse when he feels he might be losing direct control, he agrees. He signs off on the order to halt.
And then you have the X factor of Hermann Göring whispering in his ear.
Oh, Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. He flies in, all pomp and circumstance, and essentially says, "My Führer, leave it to me. My beautiful Luftwaffe will finish them off on the beaches. You don't need to risk a single one of your precious tanks."
Which was just pure ego talking.
100% ego. The Luftwaffe was just as exhausted as the Army. The weather over the English Channel was cloudy and bad. They couldn't fly effectively for large parts of the evacuation.
And the result is Operation Dynamo, the miracle of Dunkirk.
Yeah. Britain mobilizes everything that can float.
People picture the little ships, fishing boats and pleasure yachts, which is true. But it was a massive military operation, too.
It was over 800 vessels in total, including dozens of Royal Navy destroyers doing the heavy lifting. But the number that matters is 338,000.
338,000 Allied soldiers evacuated from the beaches.
And you have to understand the strategic impact of that. If those 300,000 men, the core of the professional British Army, are captured,
Britain is out of the war.
They almost certainly have to sue for peace. There's no army left to defend the island. That single pause, that one decision born of nerves and ego, ensured that Britain remained in the war.
A defeated army lives to fight another day. And because Britain is still in the fight, Hitler now has to deal with the problem of the Royal Air Force.
Which leads directly to the next case study in ego, completely overriding sound military strategy, the Battle of Britain.
So the goal was simple: air superiority. Hitler's plan to invade Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was dead in the water without it.
You can't launch an amphibious invasion if the enemy controls the sky above the beach.
And initially, the Luftwaffe strategy was working, wasn't it? They were hammering the RAF's infrastructure.
They were doing tremendous damage. They were targeting the sector stations, the radar masts, the runways, the maintenance hangars. The RAF was on the verge of breaking. They were losing experienced pilots faster than they could possibly train new ones.
They were just a few weeks away from total collapse. And
Yeah.
then the accident.
August 24th, 1940. A squadron of German bombers gets lost in the dark, on their way to a legitimate military target, an aircraft factory.
And they accidentally dropped their bombs on central London.
It was a simple navigation error. Hitler had given strict orders at that point not to bomb London itself. He didn't want to provoke a terror bombing campaign just yet.
But Winston Churchill sees an opportunity. He immediately orders a retaliatory raid on Berlin the very next night.
And militarily, that first British raid on Berlin was negligible. It did almost no damage. A few bombs fell in a suburb.
But psychologically, for Hitler,
It drove him insane. Absolutely insane. He had publicly promised the German people no enemy plane will ever fly over the Reich. Göring had guaranteed it.
so the red mist, as they say, descends. He goes on the radio, gives this screaming, furious speech.
Yeah, you can hear the rage in his voice. If they attack our cities, we will raze theirs to the ground. And with that, he orders a complete change in strategy.
He shifts the entire weight of the Luftwaffe away from the RAF airfields, the critical military targets, and sends them to bomb London. The Blitz begins.
And for the people of London, it was horrific, an absolute nightmare. But for the RAF,
It was a miracle, a lifeline.
it was the breather they desperately needed. It gave them time to repair the runways, get the radar stations back online, and most importantly, to rest their exhausted pilots. By the time the Luftwaffe came back for a massive daylight battle on September 15th, The RAF was ready for them.
And this is where the British advantages in technology, like their integrated radar system, really paid off. They weren't just flying blind patrols.
No, it was the first integrated air defense system in history. They could see the German formations building up over France on their radar screens. They knew the altitude, the direction, the numbers. They could scramble their fighters at the last possible second to intercept them, saving precious fuel.
It was a game of efficiency, and the Germans lost that game because their leader got distracted by pure, simple vengeance.
So Operation Sea Lion is postponed indefinitely. The invasion is off. And Germany has suffered its first major defeat of the war.
I want to talk about the rot that was setting in at the top, because by 1941, the whole way decisions are made in the Third Reich is becoming deeply, deeply dysfunctional.
Dysfunctional is putting it mildly. The entire system was built on the Führer principle, which meant that all authority, all decisions flowed directly from Hitler. There was no cabinet, no joint chiefs of staff in the way we'd understand it.
And his personal lifestyle starts to have a huge strategic impact on the war. We have to talk about his personal physician, Dr. Theodore Morell.
Dr. Morell. He was, by most accounts, a complete quack. By 1941, he was injecting Hitler on a daily basis with this bizarre cocktail of substances.
And we're not talking about vitamins here. We're talking powerful opiates like Eucadol, which is basically oxycodone. We're talking about methamphetamine, animal hormones, all sorts of strange concoctions.
So you have a world leader whose mood and energy levels are wildly oscillating between chemically induced euphoria and crashing fatigue. And this completely messes up his schedule. He's staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning watching movies and delivering these long, rambling monologues to his staff.
And then sleeping in until noon or 1 o'clock the next day.
And his staff are absolutely terrified of waking him up. We'll see how fatal that becomes later on. But even at 41, it meant the entire German war machine was often running on a 10-hour delay, waiting for the Führer to have his breakfast.
Plus, he's surrounded himself with sycophants, people who will only tell him what he wants to hear.
Field Marshal Keitel is the prime example. He was known as Le Keitel in the army, which is a pun on the German word for lackey. His nickname was the Nodding Donkey because he just agreed with everything Hitler said.
If you were a general who disagreed with Hitler, who presented facts he didn't like,
you were fired. You were sidelined. You were sent to a quiet front. So the feedback loop that any leader needs to make good decisions is completely broken.
which leads us to the biggest, most catastrophic gamble of them all. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union.
This was the ideological heart of the war for Hitler. Lebensraum, living space in the East. He saw it as Germany's destiny to colonize Russia and enslave its population.
And he hated the Soviet Union with a passion. He was obsessed with destroying what he called Jewish Bolshevism.
So in June 1941, he breaks his non-aggression pact with Stalin and launches the invasion.
But when you look at the logistics of it, it's just baffling. Germany is a modern industrial power, but a huge portion of its army is still reliant on horses for transport.
Thousands and thousands of horses. And they're invading a country with almost infinite geography and practically no paved roads.
And they completely, totally underestimated their opponent.
It all came down to racism. They were blinded by their own ideology. They viewed the Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, as subhuman, incapable of fighting effectively or organizing a modern state.
Which is where you get that famous, chilling quote from Hitler. "We have only to kick in the front door and the whole rotten edifice will come tumbling down."
And that kick in the door mentality meant they didn't plan for a long war. They didn't plan for failure. The entire operation was based on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse in maybe 3 to 4 months, tops.
Let's talk about something as simple as the railway gauge. I think this is a perfect example of the logistical nightmare they walked into.
It's a great example. Russian railway tracks were, and still are, wider than the standard European gauge.
Which means German supply trains couldn't run on Russian tracks.
Right. They had to either physically pull up the Russian rails and re-spike them to the narrower German gauge as they advanced, which is incredibly slow work, or they had to offload everything from the trains onto trucks at the border.
And as you said, the Russian roads were mostly just dirt tracks, so when the autumn rains start,
The Respetitsa. The mud season. The roads turn into these waist-deep quagmires. The trucks sink up to their axles. The horses, which are pulling most of the artillery and supply wagons, just die of exhaustion in the mud. The entire German advance literally grinds to a halt.
and then after the mud comes General Winter.
The arrogance here is just stunning. The German quartermaster general, the guy in charge of supplies, actually raised the issue of ordering winter clothing in the summer of 41.
And what was he told?
He was told to stop worrying about it, to stop being a pessimist, because the war would be over long before the first snowflake fell.
So you have millions of men facing a brutal Russian winter in their thin summer uniforms, temperatures dropping to -30, -40 degrees Celsius.
The first-hand accounts are just visceral. Soldiers' hands freezing to the metal of their guns. The lubricating oil in the tank engines turning into a thick gel, so they had to light dangerous fires under the engines just to get them to start.
And the weapons themselves just stopped working.
The lubricants froze solid. Firing pins would snap. The telescopic sights on rifles would freeze to a soldier's eye if he got too close. Meanwhile, the Soviets launch a counteroffensive with fresh Siberian divisions who are fully equipped for the cold.
In white camouflage, on skis, with weapons that are designed to work in the freezing temperatures.
It was a disaster. The German defensive stalls right at the very gates of Moscow. Some of the forward units could actually see the spires of the Kremlin, but they couldn't go any further.
That's the first time the German army is truly stopped and thrown back on land. But the real irreversible breaking point comes the next year, in 1942, Stalingrad.
Stalingrad is where the personal tragedy of Hitler's leadership style really culminates. Strategically, the German summer offensive in 42 was aimed south at the Caucasus to seize the Soviet oil fields.
Which makes sense. Germany was desperate for oil.
It was the smart, logical military objective. But on the way south, Hitler becomes distracted by the city on the Volga River.
Because it bore Stalin's name.
Exactly. It immediately transformed from a secondary objective into a primary obsession. It became a personal contest of wills between him and Stalin. So he diverts his best army, the elite Sixth Army, away from the oil fields and orders them to take the city.
And the fighting in the city itself
Okay.
was called Rattenkrieg.
A rat war. It completely neutralized the German advantage in mobile warfare. This wasn't about sweeping tank maneuvers on the steppe anymore. This was brutal, house-to-house, room-to-room fighting. Fighting for a single cellar, a sewer pipe, a pile of rubble.
And while the Sixth Army is getting bogged down in this meat grinder, the Soviets are quietly planning something huge. Operation Uranus.
They mass over 1 million men on the German flanks, which were held by much weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops.
And when the Soviets strike in November 42, those flanks just collapse.
They slice through them like butter, and within a few days, the entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, is encircled. They're trapped. Now, this is the critical moment. The commander on the ground, General Paulus, is trapped, but he has just enough fuel and supplies to attempt a breakout. He radios Hitler and asks for permission to retreat and save his army. And this is where that no-retreat dogma, which Hitler had developed during the winter of 41, condemns them all to die. Sitting in his warm bunker hundreds of miles away in East Prussia, Hitler absolutely forbids it.
And he promises he can supply them by air.
A complete fantasy. Goering again promises he can fly in 500 tons of supplies a day. On their best day, they managed maybe a fifth of that.
So the men inside the pocket were starving, freezing.
They were eating the horses. Then they were boiling leather belts for soup. By the time Paulus finally surrenders in early 1943, 91,000 survivors go into Soviet captivity.
Of whom only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again.
The loss was catastrophic, not just in men, but in morale. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever on the banks of the Volga.
It's just staggering. But while this disaster is unfolding in Russia, Hitler makes another decision, another unforced error, that arguably seals Germany's fate even faster.
Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
Now, under the terms of the tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan, Germany was only obligated to come to Japan's aid if Japan was attacked.
Right, it was a defensive alliance. Since Japan was the aggressor against the U.S., Germany had no treaty obligation to do anything.
Exactly. Hitler could have, and probably should have, stayed out of it. Let the U.S. focus all its energy on Japan in the Pacific. In fact, his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, strongly advised against it.
So why on earth did he declare war on the United States just 4 days later?
There are a few reasons. He believed that war with the U.S. was inevitable eventually, so he wanted to strike first. He hoped that by showing solidarity, Japan might be encouraged to attack the Soviet Union from the east, creating a two-front war for Stalin.
Which they never did.
They never did. But mostly, it was that same old arrogance and underestimation. He held this deep contempt for America. He viewed it as a mongrel nation, a decadent, commercially obsessed country that was racially impure and incapable of fighting a true warrior nation like Germany.
He had no idea what he was unleashing. He woke the sleeping giant.
And this is when the industrial reality of the war sets in. Because once the United States is fully mobilized and in the fight in Europe, the math, the simple production math, becomes completely and utterly impossible for the Axis.
The production statistics are just mind-blowing. Let's take the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford. At its peak, it was producing a brand new 4-engine B-24 Liberator bomber.
Every 63 minutes.
Every 63 minutes. A complex, heavy bomber rolling off the assembly line in about the time it takes to watch a movie.
And you contrast that with German aircraft production. They were still treating manufacturing like a craft. Lots of hand finishing of parts, constant tinkering with designs on the assembly line, which slowed everything down. They valued this idea of engineering perfection over sheer volume.
And then there are the Liberty ships.
A perfect example. The U.S. was building these simple, ugly, but effective cargo ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. They were welding the hulls together in massive prefabricated sections. The record was a ship built from keel laying to launch in under 5 days.
So the U-boat threat, which had almost starved Britain out of the war, was neutralized by sheer industrial brute force.
Brute force and better technology, like radar and sonar. But the volume was key. Meanwhile, Germany is starving for resources.
They have no natural oil reserves to speak of. They're trying to produce synthetic fuel from coal, which is an incredibly expensive and inefficient process.
And they're running out of everything else. Rubber, steel alloys, you name it. They're fighting a fully mechanized war on a shoestring budget.
Which is made so much worse by the fact that they are now fighting too many wars at once. This is the strategic overstretch.
They are bleeding men and material dry on the Eastern Front. They've been forced to send the elite Africa Corps under Rommel to prop up Mussolini in North Africa, which was a logistical dead end.
Then the Allies invade Italy, Italy surrenders, and Germany has to occupy its former ally, tying down even more divisions.
And all the while, they have to keep hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in France, waiting for the inevitable Allied invasion of Western Europe.
D-Day, June 6, 1944. And we have to come back to Hitler's leadership failure here, because the D-Day story is maybe the most perfect, tragic encapsulation of the Hitler factor.
It really is. So the Allies land at dawn, reports start flooding into German headquarters, but the response is slow, confused, paralyzed. Why?
Because the most powerful units available to counter the invasion, the elite Panzer Reserves, were under Hitler's direct personal command. No one else could move them.
And where is Hitler?
He's asleep.
He had taken a sleeping pill the night before.
Yeah.
He's asleep at his mountain retreat in the Alps. And his adjutants, his staff officers, they refused to wake him up.
They were too terrified of his temper.
So the tanks that could have, and you know there's a debate about this, but could have potentially driven the Allies back into the sea. They just sat there.
With their engines off?
For hours. While the Americans and British were pouring men and material onto the beaches and establishing a solid foothold, by the time Hitler finally woke up around noon and gave his permission to release the tanks, it was too late. The skies had cleared and Allied fighter bombers owned the air. If those tanks tried to move in daylight, they'd be annihilated.
But the window of opportunity was gone. It's just incredible. The entire fate of the war in the West hanging on a sleeping pill and a couple of terrified staff officers.
It just shows how fundamentally brittle a dictatorship is. If the one man at the top isn't functioning, the entire machine just grinds to a halt.
And on the other side, you have the Allies functioning with incredible coordination. And they have a game-changing secret weapon, intelligence.
Ultra. The breaking of the German Enigma code. And this wasn't just, a minor advantage. This changed everything.
They could read German orders almost as soon as they were sent.
They knew where the U-boat wolf packs were assembling in the Atlantic, so they could route the convoys safely around them. Before a battle, an Allied commander often knew exactly how many tanks the German division opposite him had, how much fuel they had left, and sometimes even what their attack plan was for the next day.
It's like playing a high-stakes poker game where you can see everyone else's cards.
It's an almost unbeatable advantage.
Yeah.
It's estimated that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years.
So we move into the endgame. Late 44, early 1945, the vice is closing.
Relentlessly. In the East, the Soviets launch Operation Bagration. It's actually a bigger military defeat for Germany than Stalingrad was, though it's less famous. They completely destroy the German Army Group Center and tear a hole in the front hundreds of miles wide. The Red Army is now pouring into Poland and heading for Berlin.
And in the West, after D-Day, the Allies break out of Normandy, liberate Paris, and cross the Rhine into Germany itself. The Ruhr industrial heartland is surrounded. The German war economy is finished.
And yet, Hitler is down in the Führer bunker in Berlin, completely disconnected from this reality.
Moving imaginary armies on a map.
Exactly. That famous scene from the movie Downfall, which is based on eyewitness accounts, where he orders General Steiner to launch a pincer attack to relieve Berlin.
An attack with an army that no longer exists.
Steiner has nothing. He has a handful of cooks, mechanics, a few thousand exhausted infantrymen with no ammunition. He can't attack. And when Hitler is told this, that's the moment he finally realizes it's all over.
But even then, right up to the end, there was this delusion about wonder weapons saving the day.
The Wunderwaffen, the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile.
The first ballistic missiles in history. A terrifying technological leap.
A technological marvel, absolutely. But as a weapon of war at that stage, completely useless. They were wildly inaccurate. You couldn't aim them at a specific target like a factory or a bridge. They just fell on cities and killed civilians. They had zero tactical impact on the battlefield, and they consumed vast resources that Germany desperately needed for things like fighter jets and tanks.
So finally, the Soviets are fighting in the streets of Berlin, just blocks from the bunker. Hitler commits suicide on April 30th. The war in Europe ends about a week later.
And we're left looking at the ruins of an entire continent.
When you step back and you look at this whole timeline, this whole chain of events, from the whole order at Dunkirk to Hitler sleeping in on D-Day, a really clear theme just emerges.
It's the total failure of the great man theory of history. The entire Nazi ideology was built on the idea that one leader, one genius with enough willpower, could bend reality to his wishes.
But reality, physics, logistics, economics, the Russian winter, it doesn't care about your willpower.
Not at all. Arrogance blinded them to the logistical nightmare of invading Russia. Impatience and ego caused them to declare war on the United States before they were remotely ready. And the complete centralization of power meant that when the leader's mind and judgment started to fail, the entire military structure failed right along with him.
Germany didn't lose because its soldiers stopped fighting. The historical record is very clear on that. They fought with incredible, often fanatical discipline right up to the very end.
No, they lost because their leadership stopped thinking. They replaced sound military strategy with ideological fantasy. And in a total war of that scale, ideology loses to logistics and industrial production every single time.
That is a powerful place to land. And it's a sobering reminder that things like competence, listening to expert feedback, and having a healthy respect for reality are not just, good management principles. They are genuine survival strategies. So that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for spending your time with Curious Minds. If you found this discussion interesting, feel free to like, comment, and share your thoughts. And as always, stay curious, stay grounded, and hope to have you join us for the next one.